Sometimes the most broken places hold the most beautiful secrets. Martin Reyes stood in the rain, staring at what 50 cents had bought him, a crumbling hotel that looked like it belonged in a ghost story. His 2 children huddled beside him, their breath forming small clouds in the mountain air. Everyone at the foreclosure auction had laughed when he raised his hand. Who would want a building with no roof, no power, and a reputation for being cursed? But Martin wasn't buying real estate. He was buying hope. 3 months after losing his construction job and facing eviction, this rotting shell of a hotel was his family's last chance at staying together. What he didn't know was that beneath the peeling wallpaper and broken floorboards lay a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about his late wife's disappearance. But how could a forgotten hotel hold the key to a 15-year-old mystery? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crumpled foreclosure notice in Martin's jacket pocket felt heavier than the keys to the ramshackle hotel now dangling from his weathered fingers. He pulled out the worn family photograph that had lived in his wallet for 15 years. Elena's bright smile looking back at him, her arms wrapped around their much younger children. Sophia had been just 2 then, Carlos barely walking. Now 12-year-old Sophia stood beside him with the serious expression she'd worn since her mother's disappearance, while 8-year-old Carlos kicked at loose gravel, still young enough to find adventure in their circumstances. "Papa, it looks like a haunted house from the movies," Carlos said, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The boy had inherited his mother's gift for finding wonder in unexpected places, even when their world had been turned upside down. Sophia adjusted her backpack, the one containing everything she owned, and studied the building with the analytical gaze that reminded Martin so much of Elena. "The bones are good," she said, using a phrase she'd heard him say countless times on construction sites. "The foundation looks solid, and see how thick those walls are? This place was built to last." Martin's throat tightened. At 12, his daughter shouldn't need to be practical about their living situation, shouldn't have to evaluate structural integrity to determine if they had a viable home. But Sophia had grown up faster than any child should, becoming the family's emotional anchor after Elena vanished during what was supposed to be a routine humanitarian mission to Central America. The Mountain View Inn. That's what the faded sign called it. Sat on 3 acres of overgrown land 20 minutes outside the small town of Cedar Falls, Colorado. From the road, it looked like something that belonged in a horror movie. 4 stories of weathered wood and cracked stone, with ivy crawling up the walls like gnarled fingers. Most of the windows on the upper floors were boarded up, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But Martin saw what Sophia saw. Good bones, solid craftsmanship from an era when buildings were meant to stand for generations. He'd bought it for 50 cents at the county foreclosure auction that morning, the only bidder foolish enough to take. On a property with no electricity, no running water, and what locals whispered was a curse that had driven away every owner for the past 30 years. The auctioneer had barely been able to contain his amusement when Martin raised his hand. "Going once for 50 cents, the man had called out, scanning the crowd of serious investors and property developers. "Anyone else want to bid on this beautiful fixer-upper?" The laughter that followed had burned Martin's ears, but he'd held his ground. 50 cents was all he had left after 3 months of unemployment, and it was enough. The truth was, Martin Reyes had once been one of the most sought-after finish carpenters in Colorado. His hands could coax beauty from the most stubborn wood, and his reputation for solving impossible structural problems had kept his phone ringing for 20 years. But when the recession hit and construction work dried up, his small business couldn't survive. The medical bills from Elena's long search, private investigators, travel expenses, bureaucratic fees had eaten through their savings years ago. Elena, even now, 15 years after she'd kissed him goodbye at Denver International Airport, Martin could feel the phantom weight of her wedding ring, which he'd sold 2 months ago to keep the lights on in their apartment. She'd been working with Children's Hope International, documenting refugee camps and coordinating aid shipments. Her last phone call had come from Guatemala, her voice cracking over a poor connection as she told him about children separated from their families, about a lead she was following that might help reunite dozens of kids with their parents. "I found something important, Martin," she'd said, and he could hear the excitement in her voice despite the static. "There's a pattern here, something that goes back decades. I can't explain it over the phone, but when I get home, the line had gone dead." 3 days later, her rental car was found abandoned on a mountain road, her luggage still in the trunk, her passport missing. The official investigation lasted 6 months before being quietly closed due to lack of evidence. The local authorities suggested she might have been the victim of a random crime, her body lost in the dense jungle terrain. But Martin had never believed it. Elena was too careful, too smart, too determined to just disappear. "Papa," Carlos tugged at his jacket, "are we really going to live here?" Martin knelt down to his son's level, noting how the boy's sneakers were wearing thin at the toes. They'd need new shoes before school started, but that was a problem for another day. "What do you think, mijo? Think we can turn this place into a home?" Carlos's face lit up with the resilience of childhood. "Can I have the tower room? The one with the pointy roof?" Sophia rolled her eyes with the practiced exasperation of an older sister. "That's probably where the roof leaks the worst, Carlos. We need to be practical." "Being practical doesn't mean we can't dream a little," Martin said, standing and putting his arms around both children. "Come on, let's go see what we've bought." The front door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood swollen from years of mountain weather. Martin had to put his shoulder into it to get it open, and when it finally gave way, the sound echoed through what must have once been an impressive lobby. Afternoon sunlight streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The lobby stretched up 2 stories, with a grand staircase curving along the far wall. The banister was carved mahogany, tarnished but intact, and the hardwood floors, though warped and stained, showed the quality of craftsmanship that simply didn't exist anymore. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by decades of use. "Wow," Sophia breathed, her practical facade slipping for a moment. It must have been beautiful once. Behind the lobby's reception desk, Martin found a dusty guest registry, its leather binding cracked with age. The last entry was dated 30 years ago. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, anniversary weekend." Someone had drawn a heart next to the signature, a small detail that made Martin's chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Look at this," Carlos called from across the room. He'd found a collection of old photographs hanging askew on the wall, black and white images of the hotel in its heyday. Families posing on the front porch, children playing in what must have been formal gardens, couples dancing in what looked like a ballroom. "The Mountain View Inn, established 1923, Sophia read from a brass plaque near the photographs. Family owned and operated for over 50 years, providing rest and comfort to travelers seeking the healing beauty of the Colorado mountains." Healing beauty. Martin liked that phrase. Maybe that's what they needed. Not just shelter, but healing, a place where the sharp edges of their grief might finally start to smooth. As they explored the ground floor, Martin's carpenter's eye catalogued the work ahead. The plumbing would need to be completely replaced, and they'd have to figure out how to get power restored. The kitchen was a disaster of broken appliances and water damage, but the bones were solid. Cast iron fixtures that could be restored, solid wood cabinets that just needed refinishing. "Papa, there's something weird about this place," Sophia said, as they climbed the main staircase to explore the guest rooms. Her voice carried a note of unease that made Martin pause. "Weird? How?" "I don't know. It's like—" She stopped on the landing, looking around. "It's like it's waiting for something. Like it's been empty but not abandoned, if that makes sense." Martin knew exactly what she meant. Despite 3 decades of neglect, the hotel felt expectant rather than dead, as if it had been patiently holding its breath, waiting for the right family to walk through its doors and bring it back to life. Room 312 on the 3rd floor would become Martin's bedroom, he decided. It faced east, toward the mountains where Elena had disappeared, and something about the view through the cracked window felt like a promise. This was where he would start. Each day, looking toward the horizon where his wife had vanished, and where he would end each night, still believing that someday he might understand what had happened to her. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the lobby in shades of gold and amber, Martin gathered his children close. They had sleeping bags and a camp stove, enough food for a few days, and most importantly, they had hope. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of making this place livable, but tonight, for the first time in months, they had a home that truly belonged to them. "Are you sure about this, Papa?" Sophia asked, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Martin looked around. The lobby, at the dust-covered elegance, and the promise hidden beneath years of neglect. Something about this place called to him. The same instinct that had guided him through 20 years of construction work, the same feeling that had led him to Elena at a coffee shop in Denver all those years ago. "I'm sure, Mija. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones nobody else wants." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the old building's weathered walls. But inside, wrapped in sleeping bags on the lobby floor, the Reyes family slept soundly for the first time in months. They didn't yet know that their 50-cent purchase would change everything they thought they knew about family, about history, and about the woman they had loved and lost. But the hotel knew. It had been waiting. 3 days into their new life. At the Mountain View Inn, Carlos made the discovery that would change everything. Martin had been in the basement, wrestling with corroded pipes and trying to figure out how to restore water to the building, when he heard his son's excited shout from the main office behind the reception desk. "Papa! Sophia! Come quick! I found something!" Martin dropped his wrench and hurried upstairs, finding Carlos on his hands and knees behind the old registration desk. His small frame half disappeared into what looked like a built-in cabinet. Sophia stood nearby, holding a flashlight and wearing the skeptical expression she'd perfected over the past few years. "Carlos, you're getting filthy," she scolded. "Papa said we shouldn't go poking around in places that might be unsafe. But look." Carlos wiggled backwards out of the cabinet, clutching something in his dirt-stained hands. The back panel was loose, and when I pushed on it, it moved. There's a whole space back there. In his palm lay a ring of old skeleton keys, each one different from the others, strung together on a length of faded ribbon. The metal was tarnished but solid, and each key bore a small paper tag with a room number written in careful script: 201, 215, 312, 407. Martin took the keys, feeling their surprising weight. These weren't the mass-produced locks you'd find in a modern hotel. Each key was individually crafted, with unique tooth patterns and decorative handles. "These must be the original room keys," he said, examining them more closely. "Most old hotels used skeleton keys like this before electronic locks." "Can we try them?" Carlos asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Can we see what's in the rooms?" Sophia moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "Some of those rooms are on floors we haven't even explored yet. And Papa, look," she pointed to one of the keys. "Room 312. That's your room." Martin had been sleeping in room 312 for 3 nights, but he'd never properly searched it. He'd been too exhausted from the day's work to do more than roll out his sleeping bag and collapse. Now, looking at the ornate key that matched his room number, he felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with unease. They climbed to the 3rd floor together, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Room 312 sat at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar, just as Martin had left it that morning. But when he inserted the skeleton key and turned it, he heard something unexpected, a soft click from somewhere inside the room, as if the key had triggered a secondary mechanism. "Did you hear that?" Sophia asked, stepping closer to her father. Martin pushed open the door and immediately noticed what he'd missed in his exhaustion. A section of the wooden floor near the window that didn't quite match the rest of the planking. The boards were the same age and type, but they'd been removed and replaced at some point, the nail patterns slightly different. Using the flashlight Sophia handed him, Martin knelt and examined the floorboards more carefully. When he pressed down on one particular board, it gave slightly, and he could see a hairline gap around a rectangular section about 2 feet by 3 feet. "It's a hidden compartment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carlos, hand me that crowbar from my toolbox." Working carefully to avoid damaging the historic wood, Martin pried up the loose section of flooring. Beneath lay a metal strongbox, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. "Should we open it?" Sophia asked, but she was already moving closer, her practical nature warring with her curiosity. The strongbox wasn't locked, just latched. When Martin lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and leather drifted up, along with something else, a faint floral scent that made his heart skip a beat. It smelled like Eleanor's perfume. Inside the box lay a collection of items that made no immediate sense. Several hotel guest registries from different time periods, a stack of letters tied with string, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and at the bottom, a leather journal with "Property of E. Reyes" written on the cover in Elena's unmistakable handwriting. Martin's hands shook as he lifted the journal. Elena's journal, hidden beneath the floorboards of room 312 in a hotel he'd bought for 50 cents 3 days ago. The coincidence was impossible, but there it was, solid and real in his hands. "Papa." Sophia's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Papa, what is it?" He opened the journal to the first page, where Elena had written a date 15 years ago, just 1 week before she'd left for Guatemala. The entry was brief, but electric. "The pattern is bigger than I thought. The Mountain View Inn is connected to the disappearances, but not the way anyone expects. Children have been saved here, not lost. Someone called the Sparrow has been operating a rescue network for decades, and the official records have been deliberately suppressed. I need to go there to see what's still hidden." Martin sank into the dusty chair by the window, the journal clutched against his chest. Elena had been here. She had known about this place, had investigated it, had hidden this journal in his room. The room that was now his room. The room she somehow knew he would find. "Papa, you're scaring me," Carlos said, climbing onto the chair's arm and leaning against his father. "What does it say?" "Your mama was here," Martin said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before she disappeared, she was investigating this hotel. She knew something about it, something important." Sophia picked up one of the newspaper clippings from the strongbox. The headline read, "Local hotel closes after mysterious fire." The date was from 30 years ago, right around the time the guest registry had stopped. "Papa, look at this." And this one, Children's Advocacy Group demands investigation into missing refugee files. They're all about missing children and cover-ups. Martin flipped through more of Elena's journal entries, his heart racing with each revelation. She had traced a pattern of refugee children who had supposedly died or gone missing during resettlement efforts, but who had actually been secretly placed in safe homes. The Mountain View Inn had been one of the safe houses, part of an underground network that saved children from bureaucratic failures and dangerous situations. Someone called the Sparrow was running the operation, Martin read aloud from Elena's notes. Official records were altered to hide the children's real locations, making it appear they had died or disappeared. But they were actually being protected, given new identities, placed with families who could keep them safe from the forces that had originally threatened them. "Like a secret superhero," Carlos said, his eyes wide with wonder. "But if it was helping children, why keep it secret?" Sophia asked, her logical mind working through the implications. Martin continued reading Elena's careful notes. Because some of the children were being hidden from their own governments, from officials who might have sent them back to dangerous situations, and because some very powerful people were making money from the official system, people who wouldn't want their corruption exposed. The final entry in Elena's journal was dated the day before she left for Guatemala. I found evidence that the Sparrow is still operating, still saving children. But there are people who will do anything to keep this secret buried. I have to be careful. If something happens to me, I've hidden everything Martin will need to continue the work. He's the only person I trust completely. Martin closed the journal, his mind reeling. Elena hadn't disappeared on a random humanitarian mission. She had been investigating a conspiracy that reached back decades, and someone had silenced her to protect it. Now, 15 years later, he was sitting in the exact room where she had hidden the evidence, holding the proof that her death had not been an accident. Papa? Sophia's voice was small and uncertain. If Mama was investigating bad people and something happened to her, are we in danger too? Before Martin could answer, they heard the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway below. Through the cracked window, he could see a black SUV pulling up to the hotel's entrance. Two men in expensive suits got out, looking distinctly out of place in the mountain wilderness. "Quick," Martin said, gathering up the contents of the strongbox. "Help me put everything back. We need to hide this until I can figure out what to do." But even as they worked to conceal their discovery, Martin knew their lives had just changed forever. Elena's journal hadn't just revealed the truth about her disappearance. It had made them the new guardians of a secret that powerful people would kill to protect. Outside, car doors slammed, and Martin heard voices approaching the front entrance. The visitors had arrived. The men in suits didn't bother to knock. Martin heard the front door creak open as he quickly replaced the floorboards in room 3 and 12. Elena's journal now safely hidden back in its strongbox. Through the window, he watched. A third man emerged from the SUV, older, silver-haired, wearing the kind of confidence that came with serious money. "Hello?" a voice called from the lobby below. "Mr. Reyes, I believe we have business to discuss." Martin motioned for the children to stay quiet and slipped out into the hallway. From the top of the grand staircase, he could see the 3 visitors standing in his lobby as if they owned the place. The silver-haired man wore a tailored coat that probably cost more than Martin made in a month when he had steady work. "I'm Martin Reyes," he called down, not moving from the advantageous position at the top of the stairs. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My apologies for the intrusion. I'm Harrison Blake, Blake Development Corporation. Perhaps you've heard of us?" Martin had indeed heard of Blake Development. They were the ones buying up half the county, turning family farms into luxury vacation resorts and pushing out locals who couldn't afford the rising property taxes. He descended the stairs slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Mr. Blake, what brings you to my hotel?" "Your hotel," Blake chuckled, looking around at the water-stained walls and boarded windows. "Yes, I heard about your remarkable purchase. 50 cents for 3 acres and a building, quite the bargain." "It's worth exactly what I paid for it," Martin said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "Maybe less, considering the work ahead." "Oh, I think you're being modest. This property has potential, which is why I'm here to make you an offer you'll find very generous." Blake gestured to one of his companions, who produced a leather briefcase. $100,000 cash for the deed. You could walk away today with enough money to start fresh anywhere you'd like. The offer hit Martin like a physical blow. $100,000 was more money than he'd ever seen at one time. It would solve every financial problem his family faced, would give them a real chance at rebuilding their lives. But something about Blake's eagerness set off alarm bells. "That's a generous offer," Martin said carefully, "but we just moved in. I'm not ready to sell." Blake's smile flickered. "Mr. Reyes, let me be frank. This building is a money pit. No power, no plumbing, structural damage throughout. You have 2 young children to think about. Is this really the environment you want to raise them in? From the corner of his eye, Martin saw Sophia appear at the top of the stairs, her face set in the stubborn expression she'd inherited from Elena. Behind her, Carlos peeked around the banister, his eyes wide with curiosity. "My children are fine," Martin said, his voice hardening, "and the building has good bones. With time and work, it'll be a beautiful home." "Time and work require money, Mr. Reyes. Money you don't have." Blake's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "I've done my research. You're 3 months behind on rent at your previous address, you've defaulted on your business loans, and you're facing eviction proceedings. This offer could solve all of that." The casual mention of his financial situation sent a chill down Martin's spine. Blake had investigated him, knew details about his personal life that weren't public record. This wasn't a random business opportunity, this was something more targeted. "Thanks for the offer, but no thanks," Martin said firmly. "The property isn't for sale." Blake studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his companions. "Very well, but Mr. Reyes, I should mention that this property has a rather troubled history. Previous owners have faced difficulties, insurance problems, permit issues, unexpected legal challenges. Sometimes these old buildings come with more baggage than people expect." The threat was delivered with the same pleasant smile. But Martin heard it clearly. Blake wasn't just making an offer. He was making a warning. "I appreciate your concern," Martin said, moving toward the front door in a clear dismissal. "But we're planning to stay." After the men left, gravel crunching under their tires as they drove away, Martin gathered his children in the lobby. Sophia had found a piece of paper tucked under a loose stone near the fireplace, a child's drawing, in colored pencil showing the hotel, with arrows pointing to various locations, and the words "secret places" written in a young hand. "Papa, who was that man?" Carlos asked, still clutching the drawing they'd discovered. "Someone who wants to buy our hotel," Martin said, kneeling down to examine the child's map more closely. The drawing showed rooms and corridors that he hadn't even explored yet, with X marks indicating hidden spots throughout the building. "But we don't want to sell it, right?" Sophia said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Even for all that money?" Martin looked around their decrepit lobby, at the water stains and boarded windows, and the massive amount of work ahead of them. $100,000 would buy them a small house in town, maybe even enough left over for him to restart his business. It would be the practical, responsible choice. But Elena's journal was hidden upstairs, filled with secrets that had gotten her killed. Blake's unexpected appearance just hours after they'd discovered it couldn't be a coincidence. Someone wanted this property badly enough to kill for it, which meant there was something here worth protecting. "No," he said finally, "we're not selling. This is our home now." That afternoon, while the children explored the hotel's upper floors using the secret map as their guide, Martin walked the property boundaries, trying to understand what made this place so valuable. The hotel sat on a rise, overlooking a valley that stretched toward the mountains where Elena had disappeared. It was isolated enough for privacy, but close enough to town for supplies. Perfect for hiding people who needed to disappear. Behind the hotel, he found the remnants of formal gardens, now overgrown with native plants and wildflowers. A stone path led through what had once been manicured lawns to a small outbuilding that might have been a caretaker's cottage. The windows were intact, and when he peered inside, he could see it had been lived in more recently than the main hotel. "Papa!" Sophia's voice called from somewhere above him. He looked up to see her hanging out of a fourth-floor window, grinning with excitement. Carlos found something amazing. "Come see." He found them in what had clearly been the hotel's finest suite, a corner room with windows facing both the mountains and the valley. Carlos was standing in what appeared to be a solid wall, but Martin could see now that it was actually a cleverly concealed door. "Watch this!" Carlos pushed against a section of the wooden paneling, and it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into the hotel's tower room. "It's not just a secret passage," Sophia said, her face flushed with discovery. It's like the whole hotel is designed with hidden spaces. Look at this map. There are secret rooms all over the building. The child's drawing had been remarkably accurate. As they explored using the map as their guide, they found hidden compartments. Behind bookcases, concealed panels that opened onto narrow walkways between walls, and even a dumbwaiter system that could move people and supplies between floors without being seen from the main corridors. It's like the hotel was designed to hide people, Martin said, thinking of Elena's journal and the stories about refugee children being secretly sheltered here. Papa, do you think we're the good guys or the bad guys in this story? Carlos asked, as they climbed the narrow stairs to the tower room. The question stopped Martin cold. In fairy tales, it was always clear who wore the white hats and who wore the black hats. But real life was more complicated. Blake had offered them enough money to solve all their problems, and all they had to do was walk away from a building that might genuinely be dangerous. But Elena had died trying to protect the secrets hidden in this place. If Martin sold to Blake now, her sacrifice would mean nothing. We're the ones who stick around to find out the truth, he said finally. Even when it's scary. The tower room, at the top of the hotel, took his breath away. Windows on all four sides provided a panoramic view of the entire valley, and the space felt like a ship's crow's nest, perched high above the mountain wilderness. But what made Martin's heart race was what they found carved into the wooden beams. Dozens of names and dates etched by hand, some going back decades. Maria Santos, 1967, Sophia read aloud from one of the beams. James Chen, 1943. Anna Kowalski, 1955. She looked up at her father with wide eyes. Papa, these aren't just names. They're like a memorial. Martin studied the carvings more closely. Next to each name was a small symbol. Sometimes a bird in flight, sometimes a simple cross, sometimes just initials. But there was a pattern to them, a coded message that someone had taken great care to preserve. "The sparrow," he whispered, running his fingers over a carving near the window. "These are the children who were saved." As the sun began to set, painting the tower room in shades of gold and amber, Martin made a decision that would change their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work of restoration, not just of the building, but of the truth that Elena had died trying to protect. Blake could keep his money. The Reyes family had found something worth much more than $100,000. They had found their purpose. The coded journal pages had kept Martin awake most of the night. Elena's careful handwriting filled dozens of torn sheets hidden throughout the hotel, each one documenting another piece of the puzzle. Some were tucked behind loose wallpaper, others wedged into gaps in the window frames, and a few had been sealed in mason jars buried in the overgrown garden. By morning, Martin had assembled a makeshift workspace in the lobby, spreading Eleanor's findings across the dusty reception desk, like pieces of a vast jigsaw puzzle. Sophia proved surprisingly adept at recognizing patterns in the coded entries, while Carlos had an uncanny ability to spot the subtle marks Elena had left to indicate where additional clues were hidden. "Look at this one, Papa," Sophia said, holding up a page covered in what appeared to be gibberish. "If you read every third word, it makes sense. Children relocated safely, underground tunnel system, active rescue operation continues." Mama was being super careful not to write anything obvious. Martin felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. Even in danger, Elena had been thinking like the investigative journalist she'd trained to be before switching to humanitarian work. She'd hidden evidence throughout the hotel in a way that would be meaningless to casual searchers, but clear to someone who knew her methods. The pieces were forming a disturbing picture. The Mountain View Inn had operated as a way station for an underground network that rescued refugee children from bureaucratic failures and outright trafficking. Official records had been falsified to show the children as deceased or lost, while they were actually given new identities and placed with protective families. But if this was helping children, why did it have to be secret? Carlos asked, looking up from the colored pencils he was using to trace Elena's coded maps. Because some very bad people were making money from the official system, Martin explained, thinking of Blake's veiled threats the day before. People who wouldn't want their crimes exposed. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their work. Through the lobby windows, Martin saw an old Toyota pickup truck approaching. Definitely not Blake, returning with more pressure. An elderly Asian woman climbed out, moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd earned respect through decades of quiet strength. Mrs. Chen, Sophia said, recognizing their visitor from town. She runs the Historical Society. Martin had met Eleanor Chen briefly at the grocery store, where she'd been one of the few locals to speak kindly about his purchase of the hotel. Most people had either laughed or warned him about the property's cursed reputation, but Mrs. Chen had simply said, "That place has stories to tell. Maybe it's time someone listened." She knocked politely on the front door, waiting for permission to enter, despite the fact that it stood wide open. Martin appreciated the courtesy. It felt like respect, rather than the casual invasion Blake had staged the day before. "Mr. Reyes, I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I brought some things I thought you might find interesting." She carried a cardboard box that she set carefully on the reception desk, glancing at the coded pages Martin had spread there. Her expression remained neutral, but he caught a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Please, come in. Can I offer you some coffee? It's camp coffee, but it's hot. That would be lovely." Mrs. Chen settled into one of the lobby's dusty chairs with the air of someone returning to a familiar place. "I see you've been doing some research into the hotel's history." Elena, my wife, she was investigating this place before she disappeared, Martin said, testing whether Mrs. Chen could be trusted with the truth. "We found some of her notes." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Finally, she opened her cardboard box and withdrew a stack of black and white photographs. "Perhaps these will help provide context." The photographs showed the mountain view inn during what appeared to be its operational years, but these weren't the happy family vacation pictures they'd found on the lobby wall. These images showed something different. Groups of children of various ages and ethnicities, often with adults who were clearly not their parents, sometimes with suitcases and travel documents. 43 to 1975, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Officially, the hotel operated as a mountain resort. Unofficially, it served a different purpose entirely. "You know about the Sparrow," Martin said. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Chen's composure flickered, and for a moment she looked much younger and more vulnerable. "I was one of the children brought here," she said finally. 1943, when I was 7 years old. My parents had been interned, our family separated. The official records show that I died of pneumonia in the camp, but in reality, I was smuggled out and brought here. Sophia and Carlos had stopped their work to listen, sensing the importance of Mrs. Chen's words. Martin felt his understanding of the hotel's history shift into sharper focus. The Sparrow gave me a new name, new papers, and eventually placed me with a family in California who raised me as their own. I didn't learn the truth about my origins until I was an adult, and by then the Sparrow had disappeared. I came back to Cedar Falls 30 years ago, hoping to find answers. "And did you?" Martin asked. "Some. I learned that the network saved hundreds of children over 3 decades, Jewish refugees during the war, Native American children being forcibly removed from their families, Central American kids whose parents had been killed by government forces. But I also learned that powerful people had benefited from the official system and would do anything to keep the truth buried." Mrs. Chen reached into her box again and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "Your wife wasn't the first person to investigate this place. Over the years, several journalists and activists have tried to expose what happened here. Most gave up when they faced legal threats and professional sabotage, but a few, like Elena, kept digging. Martin opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths and disappearances, always involving people who had been asking questions about refugee children and government cover-ups. Elena's case was among them, along with a private investigator who'd died in a car accident and a social worker who'd committed suicide after facing professional disgrace. "Someone is still protecting this secret," Mrs. Chen said. "Someone with enough power to destroy lives and cover their tracks. Your wife got too close to the truth." "Blake," Martin said, thinking of the developer's casual knowledge of his personal finances and the implied threats. "He's connected to this somehow." Harrison Blake's grandfather was the county commissioner during the hotel's operational years, Mrs. Chen confirmed. He was officially responsible for refugee resettlement in this region, but he was actually skimming funds and selling children to labor operations. The Sparrows network was cutting into his profits. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Blake wasn't trying to buy the hotel for development. He was trying to destroy the evidence of his family's crimes. Elena had gotten close, enough to the truth to threaten his empire, so she'd been eliminated. "Mrs. Chen," Sophia said, her young voice unusually serious. "Are we in danger too?" The older woman looked at the children with compassion and honesty. "Yes, dear, you are, but you're also in a position to finish what your mother started, if you're brave enough." Before Martin could respond, they heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere upstairs. He motioned for everyone to stay quiet and climbed the main staircase, his heart pounding. On the third floor, he found that someone had thrown a rock through the window of room 312, his room, where Eleanor's journal was hidden. Attached to the rock was a simple message written in block letters: "Last warning, sell or face the consequences." When Martin returned to the lobby, Mrs. Chen was helping the children carefully pack away Elena's coded pages. Her face was grim but determined. "The secret has been buried for 40 years, she said, "but secrets have a way of surfacing when the time is right. Your family has inherited more than just a building, Mr. Reyes. You've inherited a responsibility." As if to underscore her point, Carlos held up one of Elena's coded pages he'd been working to decode. "Papa, I think I figured out this one. It says, 'The evidence is in the foundation. Look for the sparrow's nest where the sun sets last.'" Martin looked toward the west-facing wall of the lobby, where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Elena had left them a treasure map, and someone was willing to kill to keep them from following it. The game had begun in earnest. The sparrow's nest was literally carved into the stone foundation on the hotel's west wall, disguised as decorative masonry but clearly visible once you knew what to look for. Martin found it just as the sun was setting, a small carved alcove that had been sealed with mortar and painted over to match the surrounding stonework. Working by lamplight, he carefully chiseled away decades of concealment, while Sophia and Carlos kept watch from the upper windows. Mrs. Chen had gone home, with promises to return the next morning with additional historical documents, but not before extracting a solemn promise that Martin would contact her immediately if Blake or his men returned. Inside the hidden alcove, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected it from moisture and decay, Martin found what Elena had died trying to protect: a leather portfolio containing the original documentation of the Sparrows' operations. Names, dates, photographs, and most damaging of all, copies of official government correspondence showing that high-ranking officials had known about the child trafficking and had actively participated in covering it up. The portfolio also contained something that made Martin's hands shake: a letter addressed to him personally, written in Elena's careful script and dated the day before she left for Guatemala. "My dearest Martin," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and you have found your way to the place where our story truly begins. The Mountain View Inn isn't just connected to my investigation, it's where my life was saved when I was a child." Martin had to sit down on the cold stone steps to continue reading. Elena had never told him she'd been a refugee, had never mentioned being separated from her family as a child. But as he read her letter, pieces of their life together that had never quite made sense suddenly clicked into place. Her fierce dedication to humanitarian work, her reluctance to talk about her childhood, her ability to connect with traumatized children in ways that went beyond professional training. I was brought to the Mountain View Inn in 1975 when I was 6 years old. Elena's letter continued. My parents had been killed in El Salvador, and I was part of a group of children being trafficked to work in agricultural operations in California. The Sparrows Network intercepted us and brought us here, where I spent 3 months recovering from trauma and learning English before being placed with the family who raised me as their own. Eleanor had been one of the last children saved by the Sparrow before the network was exposed and shut down. The family who adopted her had given her a new identity, complete with falsified birth records and a cover story that turned her from a Salvadoran refugee into the Colorado-born girl Martin had fallen in love with in that Denver coffee shop. I've spent my adult life trying to find the Sparrow, to thank them for saving not just my life, but my soul, the letter went on. My humanitarian work has always been my way of paying forward the gift I was given. But in my research, I discovered that the network's exposure wasn't accidental. It was betrayed by people who were profiting from the trafficking operations. The rest of the letter detailed Elena's investigation into the cover-up, including her discovery that several prominent Colorado families had built their fortunes on money stolen from refugee assistance programs. The Blake family had been at the center of it, using their political connections to divert federal funds while selling children to labor contractors. Harrison Blake's grandfather wasn't just complicit, Elena had written. He was the mastermind, and the current generation has spent 40 years making sure the truth stays buried. But I found evidence that the Sparrow is still alive, still operating, still saving children. If something happens to me, follow the clues I've left. Find the Sparrow. Finish what we started. The letter ended with a simple line that broke Martin's heart. You and the children are my everything. If I don't come home, know that I died trying to make the world safer for families like ours. Martin folded the letter carefully and climbed back to the lobby, where Sophia and Carlos were waiting with expressions that were far too serious for children their ages. He showed them the letter, reading it aloud by lamplight, watching their faces as they learned that their mother had once been a frightened refugee child in this very building. So Mama was saved here, just like all those other children, Sophia said, her voice thoughtful. And now we're living in the place that saved her life. It's like the hotel called us here, Carlos added, his child's mind finding magic in the patterns that connected their family to this place across decades. Martin wasn't sure about magic, but he couldn't deny the significance of the coincidences that had brought them here. Elena's investigation, their financial desperation, the 50-cent auction purchase, it all seemed orchestrated by forces beyond their understanding. The next morning brought visitors who proved that Elena's fears had been justified. Martin was in the basement trying to restore water pressure to the building when he heard cars arriving outside. Through a dirty window, he saw 3 sheriff's department vehicles and what appeared to be an official from the county building department. The time he reached the lobby, the officials were already inside, led by a deputy who looked uncomfortable with his assignment. Behind him stood Harrison Blake, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who was used to getting his way through official channels. Mr. Reyes, the deputy said, consulting a clipboard. I'm Deputy Morrison. We've received complaints about the living conditions in this building. I need to conduct a safety inspection. What kind of complaints? Martin asked, though he suspected he already knew. Blake stepped forward with a folder full of official-looking documents. As a concerned member of the community, I felt obligated to report that children are being housed in a structure without proper electrical systems, plumbing, or heating. The county has a responsibility to ensure child welfare. The building inspector, a thin man who kept wiping his hands on his pants as if touching anything in the hotel would contaminate him, began documenting violations on a pre-printed form. No electricity, no running water, structural damage to the roof, potential asbestos in the insulation, black mold in several rooms. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to red tag this building," the inspector said, producing an official notice. "It's uninhabitable in its current condition. You'll need to vacate immediately and complete a full renovation before anyone can live here legally." "How long would that take?" Martin asked, though he already knew the answer would be financially impossible. "With proper permits and inspections, probably 8 to 12 months, assuming you can afford the work. We're talking about a complete electrical and plumbing overhaul, structural repairs, environmental remediation. Easily $200,000, maybe more." Blake's smile widened. "Of course, if you're interested in selling, my offer still stands. I could purchase the property as is and handle all the renovation costs myself. It would save you the expense and hassle of dealing with all these code violations." Martin looked around the lobby where his children had been happily exploring just hours before, now seeing it through the inspector's eyes, a condemned building that posed genuine dangers to his family. But he also saw Elena's letter in his jacket pocket and the evidence hidden throughout the structure that could expose decades of crimes. "We'll find another place to stay while we do the repairs," Martin said finally. "The property isn't for sale." Blake's pleasant facade slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mr. Reyes, you should understand that properties with this many violations often face additional scrutiny, environmental inspections, archaeological surveys, tax reassessments. The costs can multiply quickly." The threat was clear. If Martin didn't sell voluntarily, Blake would use every available bureaucratic weapon to force him out. But there was something else in Blake's urgency that gave Martin hope. The man was scared. After 40 years of keeping his family's secrets buried, Blake was facing the possibility of exposure, and his increasingly desperate tactics suggested he was running out of time. "I appreciate your concern," Martin said, "but we're staying." After the officials left, Martin gathered his children for a family meeting in the hotel's dining room, where dusty chandeliers cast fractured light across their serious faces. He explained the situation honestly. They would have to move into town temporarily while he figured out how to fund the renovations, but they wouldn't abandon the hotel or the truth Elena had died to protect. "Papa," Sophia said, her voice carrying the weight of someone far older than 12. "What if we can't afford to fix everything? What if Blake finds a way to take the hotel anyway?" It was a fair question, and Martin didn't have a good answer. His savings were non-existent, his credit was destroyed, and the renovation costs were far beyond anything he could reasonably finance. But Elena's letter had mentioned something that gave him a thread of hope. The Sparrow was still alive, still operating. Maybe there were allies in this fight he hadn't discovered yet. That afternoon, while the children packed their few belongings for a temporary stay at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Martin made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a loose brick in the dining room fireplace, he found a manila envelope containing a single sheet of paper with an address in Denver and the words, "Emergency Contact, T. Pine," written in Elena's handwriting. T. Pine. The initials didn't mean anything to Martin, but Eleanor had considered this person important enough to hide their contact information in the hotel's structure. If the Sparrow was still alive, still saving children, then maybe T-Pine was the key to finding them. As they prepared to leave the hotel for what might be the last time, Carlos made one final discovery that would prove crucial in the days ahead. While searching his favorite hiding spot in the tower room, he found a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Not Eleanor's journal this time, but something much older. The ledger contained detailed records of the Sparrow's operations, written in a careful hand that spanned decades, Names of children saved, families who provided shelter, officials who were bribed or threatened to look the other way. But most importantly, it contained maps showing the complete network of safe houses and transportation routes that had operated throughout the western United States. "Papa, look at this," Sophia said, studying one of the maps by flashlight. The Mountain View Inn wasn't just one safe house, it was the headquarters, the central hub for the entire operation. Martin studied the ledger more carefully, his understanding of the hotel's importance deepening with each page. Elena hadn't just stumbled onto a local conspiracy, she had discovered the nerve center of a rescue operation that had saved thousands of children over 30 years. No wonder Blake was desperate to destroy the evidence. As they locked the hotel's front door and walked toward Mrs. Chen's truck, Martin made a silent promise to Elena's memory. He would find T-Pine, uncover the truth about the Sparrow, and ensure that the children who had been saved here would finally have their stories told. The hotel stood empty behind them, its windows dark, its secrets temporarily safe. But Martin knew this was only the beginning. Blake would escalate his attacks, and the real battle for the truth was about to begin. The Sparrow's ledger tucked safely in his jacket, Martin climbed into Mrs. Chen's truck and began planning his next move. Denver was a 4-hour drive, and T-Pine, whoever they were, represented the best hope of finding allies in a fight that was far from over. Elena's research notes were written in her own handwriting, but finding them hidden in room 312 felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. Martin discovered them 3 days later when he returned to the hotel alone, ostensibly to begin planning the renovation work, but actually to search for more clues about T-Pine and the Sparrow's current operations. The notes were tucked inside a hollowed-out section of the room's wooden windowsill, protected by a layer of wax that had preserved Elena's careful documentation of her final investigation. As Martin read by flashlight in the condemned building, he realized that his wife had been much closer to exposing the conspiracy than he'd initially understood. Blake family connections run deeper than expected, Elena had written in her precise script. Harrison Blake's grandfather, Commissioner William Blake, wasn't just skimming refugee funds. He was actively selling children to labor contractors throughout the western states. Federal records show payments totaling over $2 million. Between 1943 and 1975, adjusted for inflation worth nearly $15 million today. The notes detailed a network of corruption that reached from local officials to federal agencies, with the Blake family at its center. But Elena had also found evidence that the conspiracy was still active, still profiting from human trafficking under the cover of legitimate development projects. Blake Development Corporation has been awarded contracts for 3 major refugee resettlement facilities in the past decade. Elena's notes continued. Official capacity, 500 children total. Actual documented population, 127 children. Question: where are the other 373 children who were supposed to be housed in these facilities? Martin felt sick as he absorbed the implications. Blake wasn't just trying to cover up historical crimes, he was continuing his grandfather's work, using modern development projects to hide ongoing trafficking operations. Elena had gotten too close to exposing current crimes, which explained why her murder had been made to look like an accident rather than a simple disappearance. The final entry in Elena's notes was dated the day before she left for Guatemala. T-Pine confirmed, the Sparrow still active, still saving children from Blake's operations. Meeting arranged for next week. If something happens to me, Martin knows where to find the evidence. The hotel holds everything needed to destroy them. T-Pine hadn't just been a contact. They had been Elena's source, someone inside the current rescue operation who was feeding her information about Blake's activities. Elena's trip to Guatemala hadn't been about refugee camps. It had been cover for a secret meeting with the Sparrow themselves. Martin carefully photographed Elena's notes with his phone before returning them to their hiding place. As he prepared to leave the hotel, he heard the sound of vehicles approaching, not the official government cars from earlier in the week, but something more ominous. Through the lobby windows, he saw 3 black SUVs surrounding the building, their occupants moving with military precision. These weren't building inspectors or sheriff's deputies. These were Blake's private security, and they weren't here to serve legal papers. Martin slipped out through the hotel's rear service door, using the concealed passages Sophia and Carlos had mapped to avoid the men who were now searching the main building. From the safety of the overgrown garden, he watched as they systematically went through each room, clearly looking for something specific, probably the evidence Elena had hidden throughout the structure. He waited in the cold mountain air until the searchers gave up and drove away, then carefully made his way back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, where his children were staying. The elderly woman took one look at his face and immediately understood that the situation had escalated. They were looking for Elena's evidence, Martin said, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Chen pressed into his hands. Professional searchers, not local muscle. Blake is getting desperate, Mrs. Chen replied, which means you're getting close to something he can't afford to lose. Over dinner, Mrs. Chen shared more of her own story and her decades-long search for answers about the Sparrow. She had managed to trace several other survivors of the rescue network, now adults scattered across the country, but none of them had been able to identify the mysterious benefactor who had saved their lives. The Sparrow was incredibly careful about maintaining anonymity, Mrs. Chen explained. Even the adults who ran the safe houses never knew their real identity. They received instructions through coded messages and payments through untraceable accounts. But Elena found them, Martin said, or at least made contact with someone who knew how to reach them. T-Pine, Sophia said, looking up from the homework. She was trying to concentrate on despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding their lives. Papa, what if we try to find this person ourselves? Martin had been thinking the same thing. The Denver address Elena had hidden was their only lead, and waiting for Blake to escalate his attacks further seemed like a losing strategy. But taking his children into what was clearly a dangerous situation felt irresponsible. I could go alone, he said. Mrs. Chen, would you? No, Sophia interrupted with the fierce determination she'd inherited from Elena. We're a family. Mama died trying to protect children like us, like Mrs. Chen was. If we're going to finish her work, we do it together. Carlos nodded solemnly, his 8-year-old face set with unusual seriousness. Besides, we know the hotel better than anyone now. We might find clues you'd miss. Mrs. Chen studied the children with approval. They're right, Martin, and they're already in danger whether you acknowledge it or not. Blake knows you have Elena's evidence, and he won't stop until he gets it or eliminates the threat you represent. That night, as Martin lay awake in Mrs. Chen's spare room, he thought about the impossible situation Elena had left them in. She had died trying to expose a conspiracy that reached back decades and continued to harm children in the present day. The evidence she'd hidden could destroy Blake's operation and bring justice for hundreds of victims. But using it would put Martin's own children in mortal danger. But Eleanor's letter had been clear about her expectations. She had trusted him to finish what she started, to ensure that the truth finally came to light. And she had raised Sophia and Carlos to understand that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was dangerous. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They would go to Denver, find T-Pine, and attempt to make contact with the Sparrow. Elena had started this investigation to save children who couldn't save themselves, and her family would see it through to the end. Outside Mrs. Chen's boarding house, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, where Elena had disappeared 15 years ago. But for the first time since her death, Martin felt like he was moving toward answers rather than away from them. The Sparrow was still out there, still saving children, still fighting the same battles Elena had died for. Tomorrow, the Reyes family would join that fight, carrying Elena's research notes and the Sparrow's ledger toward what they hoped would be the end of 40 years of silence. Blake had made one crucial mistake in his desperation to cover up his family's crimes. He had underestimated the power of a father's love and a family's determination to honor the memory of the woman who had given her life to protect the innocent. Elena's final message waited for them in the most unlikely place, hidden inside the hotel's old telephone system in room 312. Martin found the recording device 3 weeks after they'd been forced to evacuate. During what was supposed to be his final visit to collect their remaining belongings before Blake's demolition crew arrived. The device was small, no bigger than a deck of cards, wired into the room's rotary phone in a way that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. It had been waiting there for 15 years, protected by the hotel's isolation and Elena's careful concealment, programmed to activate only when someone entered the specific sequence she had encoded in her hidden notes. When Martin played the recording on his phone, hearing Elena's voice for the first time since her death, he had to sit down on the dust-covered bed to steady himself. But what she said in those 3 minutes of carefully recorded testimony shattered everything he thought. He knew about her disappearance and the Sparrow's identity. "My darling Martin," Elena's voice said, slightly distorted by the old recording equipment, but unmistakably hers. "If you're hearing this, then you've followed my trail to the truth I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I'm not just investigating. The Sparrow. I am the Sparrow." Martin's hands shook as he held the phone, Elena's impossible words washing over him like a physical force. His wife, the humanitarian aid worker he'd fallen in love with in a Denver coffee shop, had been the legendary rescuer who had saved hundreds of children over decades of secret operations. "I know this is hard to understand," Elena's recording continued, "but the little girl who was saved at the Mountain View Inn in 1975 grew up to become the woman who continued that work. The family who adopted me, the Reyes family that gave me their name, were part of the original network. When I took their name in marriage to you, I was honoring both my past and my future." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Elena's frequent travel, her mysterious contacts in refugee communities, her ability to navigate bureaucratic systems that stymied other aid workers. It all made sense if she had been secretly running rescue operations under the cover of legitimate humanitarian work. "The Blake family has been hunting me for 20 years, Elena's voice explained. "They know I have evidence of their grandfather's crimes and their current trafficking operations, but they don't know my true identity. As far as they're concerned, the Sparrow is still the anonymous benefactor from the 1970s, not a refugee child who survived to become their greatest threat." Martin paused the recording, needing a moment to process the magnitude of what Elena had been hiding from him. Their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of secrecy, not deception, but protection. She had been shielding him and their children from the dangerous reality of her double life. When he resumed the playback, Elena's voice took on an urgency that made his chest tight with grief. "Blake's people found me in Guatemala. They know I have the evidence to destroy them, and they've made it clear that you and the children will be next if I don't disappear permanently. So I'm making a choice, my love. I'm going to let them think they've won." The recording crackled with static for a moment before Eleanor's voice returned, now thick with tears. "I've arranged my own death, Martin. A car accident that will look random but convincing. My body will never be found because there won't be a body to find. I've staged everything to give you and the children protection while I continue the work from the shadows." Martin felt the world tilt around him as Elena's final revelation hit home. She hadn't been murdered by Blake's people. She had faked her own death to protect her family while continuing her rescue operations under a new identity. For 15 years, while he had been grieving her loss, she had been alive somewhere, saving other people's children while sacrificing the chance to watch her own grow up. "I know "This is the cruelest gift I could give you," Eleanor's voice said, as if she could predict his emotional turmoil across the years. "Knowing I'm alive but can't come home, understanding why I had to choose the mission over our family. But Blake's people would have killed all of you to get to me, and I couldn't live with that blood on my hands." The recording ended with coordinates, a location in the Colorado mountains, where Elena said she would leave final instructions for continuing her work if something happened to make her permanent disappearance necessary. She had been planning for the possibility that her fake death wouldn't provide enough protection, that Blake would eventually figure out the truth and come after the family she'd died to save. Martin sat in the empty hotel room for a long time, after the recording ended, staring at Elena's final message while wrestling with emotions he couldn't name. Relief that she might still be alive, fury that she had let him grieve for 15 years, admiration for the scope of her hidden heroism, terror at the realization that Blake's threat was far more serious than he'd understood. But underneath all of those feelings was something else, a growing certainty that Elena's sacrifice had been leading to this moment. She had hidden the evidence throughout the Mountain View Inn, not just to expose Blake's crimes, but to prepare Martin and their children to take over the work she could no longer do openly. When he finally left the hotel and drove back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Martin carried with him more than just Elena's recording. He carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his family's life. They could take Elena's evidence to the authorities, expose Blake's operation, and try to return to some version of normal life. Or they could follow her coordinates to the mountain location, where she had promised to leave instructions for continuing the Sparrow's mission. "Papa?" Sophia asked when she saw his face as he entered Mrs. Chen's kitchen. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Martin said, gathering his children close. "But maybe not the kind of ghost we thought." That night, as he lay awake planning their next move, Martin realized that Elena's greatest deception had also been her greatest gift. She had given them not just the truth about Blake's crimes, but the opportunity to become part of something larger than their own grief. The Sparrow's work wasn't finished. It was simply waiting for new hands to carry it forward. The coordinates Elena had left pointed to a location just 20 miles from the hotel, high in the mountains where she had supposedly died. Tomorrow, Martin would take his children there and discover whether Elena's final message contained answers or just more questions. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, he fell asleep believing that his wife might still be alive somewhere, in the world, still fighting the battles that had defined her hidden life, still waiting for the day when it would be safe for the Sparrow to come home. The Sparrow's hidden archive lay beneath the Mountain View Inn's foundation, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind the hotel's furnace room that required Elena's specific sequence of keys to unlock. Martin found it using the coordinates from her recording, but what he discovered there exceeded even his wildest expectations about the scope of her secret operations. The archive was a temperature-controlled room carved directly into the mountain. Bedrock, lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes that contained decades of meticulously organized evidence. Photographs of rescued children, testimonials from adult survivors, financial records showing the flow of money through Blake's corrupt network, and most damaging of all, audio recordings of conversations between Blake family members planning murders and cover-ups spanning 40 years. "My God," Mrs. Chen whispered as they explored the archive together, her elderly hands trembling as she held photographs of herself as a child, alongside dozens of other rescued refugees. Elena documented everything. Every child, every rescue, every crime. Sophia and Carlos moved through the archive with wide eyes, understanding that they were standing in the nerve center of a secret war that had been fought in their home while they slept upstairs. The children who had carved their names in the hotel's tower room were all represented here. their stories preserved in Elena's careful files, alongside evidence of the officials who had betrayed them and the heroes who had saved them. But the archive also contained something that made Martin's blood run cold. Recent files showing that Blake's operation was still active, still trafficking children through his development projects, and still murdering anyone who got too close to the truth. Elena's faked death had protected her family for 15 years. But it hadn't stopped the crimes she'd devoted her life to exposing. "Look at this," Sophia said, pulling a thick folder from one of the filing cabinets. "These are from last year. Blake Development Corporation, refugee facility in Arizona. Official capacity, 200 children. Actual population, 47 children. Papa, this is still happening." Martin studied the recent documents with growing horror and determination. Elena hadn't just left them evidence of historical crimes. She had documented an ongoing conspiracy that was currently destroying families and enslaving children. The archive wasn't just a memorial to past heroism, it was a call to action for future justice. The most shocking discovery came when Martin found Elena's personal files, including detailed psychological profiles she had compiled on Blake and his associates. She hadn't just been fighting them, she had been studying them, learning their methods, anticipating their moves years in advance. Blake knows about the archive, Martin realized as he read Elena's strategic notes. That's why he's so desperate to demolish the hotel. He doesn't just want to destroy evidence of his grandfather's crimes. He knows Elena used this place as her headquarters for investigating his current operations. Mrs. Chen nodded grimly, "Which means we don't have much time. If Blake suspects you found the archive, he'll escalate to direct violence rather than risk exposure." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heavy machinery reached them through the archive's ventilation system. Martin climbed to ground level and peered through the hotel's lobby windows to see Blake's demolition crew setting up equipment in the parking area. Massive bulldozers and excavators capable of reducing the entire building to rubble in a matter of hours. "He's not waiting for legal permission," Martin said, returning to the archive where his family was frantically photographing the most crucial evidence. "He's just going to destroy everything and deal with the legal consequences later." The race against time intensified when Sophia discovered Elena's emergency protocols, hidden in a sealed envelope marked "Final Option." The document outlined a plan for getting the archive's evidence to multiple news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and international human rights groups simultaneously, ensuring that Blake couldn't suppress the information through his political connections. But executing Elena's plan required access to her hidden network of allies, journalists, activists, and government officials who had been secretly supporting the Sparrow's operations for decades. The contact information was encrypted using a cipher that only someone intimately familiar with Elena's methods could decode. "I can figure this out," Sophia said, studying the encrypted contacts with the same analytical intensity she'd brought to Elena's coded journal pages. "Mama taught me patterns when I was little. I thought we were just playing word games, but she was actually training me to understand her security methods." While Sophia worked to decode Elena's contact network, Carlos made a discovery that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Hidden behind a false wall in the archive, he found Elena's personal armory, not weapons for violence, but tools for survival and evidence preservation. Cameras with encrypted storage, communication devices with untraceable connections, and, most importantly, a complete backup of the archive's contents stored on portable drives. "Your mama was planning for this exact situation," Mrs. Chen said, helping Martin organize the backup drives. She knew that eventually Blake would find the archive, and she made sure her work could survive even if the building didn't. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their preparations. Through the hotel's windows, Martin could see Blake arriving with a small army of private security contractors, their vehicles forming a perimeter around the building while the demolition Crew continued setting up equipment. "We're trapped," Sophia said. Her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They're going to demolish the building with us inside it, then claim it was an accident." But Martin remembered the hotel's secret passage system that Carlos had mapped so thoroughly during their first weeks here. The network of hidden corridors and concealed exits that had once allowed the Sparrow to move children safely through the building could now provide escape routes for Elena's evidence and her family. "Not trapped," Martin said, gathering the portable drives and Elena's contact codes. "Hidden. This building was designed for exactly this kind of situation." Using Carlos's hand-drawn maps, they began moving the most crucial evidence through the hotel's concealed passages toward the exit points that opened into the surrounding forest. The irony wasn't lost on Martin. They were using the same escape routes that had saved Elena's life as a child to preserve the evidence that would expose her killers. But as they prepared to evacuate the archive, Martin made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of simply escaping with the evidence, he was going to make a stand. Blake had spent 40 years believing he could silence anyone who threatened his operation, but he had never faced a family that had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "Mrs. Chen, can you get the children and the evidence to safety?" Martin asked, his voice carrying a determination that reminded Sophia strongly of her mother. "I have something I need to finish here." "Papa, no," Sophia said, understanding immediately what he was planning. "We stick together. That's what families do." "Your mama died to protect you," Martin said gently. "I won't make the same mistake she did. I won't choose the mission over my family." But Carlos, with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children, had a different perspective. "Mama didn't choose the mission over family, Papa. She chose to make the whole world safer for families like ours. That's what we're doing too." As Blake's men began searching the hotel's main floors, getting closer to discovering the archive's entrance, Martin realized that his 8-year-old son had understood something that he had missed. Elena hadn't abandoned her family. She had been fighting to create a world where no family would have to face the choices she'd been forced to make. The evidence was more than just proof of Blake's crimes. It was Elena's legacy, her gift to every child who might be saved by the truth she had died to protect. And now it was Martin's responsibility to ensure that gift reached the people who could act on it. The battle for the Mountain View Inn was about to begin, and this time, the Sparrow's family would fight it together. The original hotel blueprint had been Elena's masterpiece of strategic planning, showing not just the building's hidden passages, but also defensive positions and escape routes that had been designed specifically for this kind of siege. Martin found it in the archive's emergency kit, annotated in Eleanor's handwriting with tactical notes that revealed just how thoroughly she had prepared for Blake's eventual assault on her stronghold. Blake's forces moved with military precision, but they were searching a building they didn't truly understand. While his men swept through the main floors looking for evidence and survivors, Martin's family used Elena's blueprint to stay one step ahead, moving through concealed passages that didn't appear on any official architectural drawings. "Papa, they're in the lobby," Sophia whispered from her position at a hidden observation post Elena had built into the hotel's main staircase. 8 men, all armed. They're not just here to demolish the building. They're here to make sure no one gets out alive. Martin felt a cold fury settle in his chest as he watched Blake's mercenaries destroy the hotel's historic features, smashing furniture and ripping out fixtures with the casual brutality of men who were paid to eliminate problems rather than solve them. This wasn't just about covering up evidence anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone else who might threaten Blake's operation. But Elena had anticipated this scenario in her strategic planning. Hidden throughout the hotel were surveillance cameras with encrypted transmissions, recording everything Blake's men did and broadcasting it to secure servers that would preserve the evidence even if the building was destroyed. Blake thought he was erasing his crimes, but he was actually documenting new ones, "Carlos, can you reach the communication equipment in the tower room?" Martin asked, consulting Elena's tactical notes. "We need to activate the emergency broadcast protocol." His 8-year-old son nodded grimly, understanding that he was being asked to undertake a dangerous mission through the hotel's most exposed areas. But Carlos had spent weeks exploring every inch of the building, and he knew passages that even Eleanor's blueprint didn't show, child-sized routes that adult searchers would never discover. As Carlos disappeared into the walls like a ghost, Martin and Sophia worked to implement Elena's defensive strategy. The hotel's hidden passages weren't just for escape. They were designed to allow defenders to move freely while forcing attackers into predictable patterns. Elena had turned the Mountain View Inn into a fortress disguised as a ruin. Movement. "On the second floor," Sophia reported from her observation post. "3 men heading toward room 312. They know something important is hidden there." Martin wasn't surprised. Room 312 had been Eleanor's operational center, the place where she had coordinated rescues and stored her most sensitive files. Even though they had moved the crucial evidence to the archive, Blake's people would expect to find something significant in the room where the Sparrow had once planned operations. Using the blueprint's marked routes, Martin positioned himself in the hidden passage behind room 312, where Eleanor had installed emergency equipment for exactly this situation. When Blake's men entered the room, they would find it apparently empty, but they would also trigger sensors that would record their conversation and transmit it to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. "We know you're in here, Reyes," one of Blake's men called out as they searched the room. "Mr. Blake is prepared to be generous. Surrender the evidence, and your children can walk away from this." Martin stayed silent, knowing that engaging with Blake's people would only give away his position. But he was recording every word, building a case for kidnapping and terrorism charges that would put Blake away, even if the trafficking evidence somehow disappeared. The searchers became more aggressive when their initial sweep turned up nothing, using sledgehammers to break through walls and pry up floorboards in their desperation to find Elena's hidden materials. But Elena had been thorough in her concealment methods. The room's secrets were protected by false walls and decoy hiding places that would take hours to properly search. "Sir, we're not finding anything," one of the men reported into his radio. "If there's evidence here, it's hidden better than we thought." Blake's voice crackled back through the radio, distorted by rage and frustration. "Then tear the whole place apart. I don't care if you have to take it down brick by brick. Find what Elena hid, or make sure it goes down with the building." Martin felt a grim satisfaction as he recorded Blake's direct confession to destroying evidence and threatening his family. Elena's hidden surveillance system was capturing everything, creating an ironclad case against Blake that would survive, even if they didn't. But the satisfaction turned to alarm when Carlos's voice came through Martin's earpiece, tight with fear. "Papa, they found the tower room entrance. They're coming up the stairs, and I can't get to the communication equipment without them seeing me." The communication equipment was crucial to Elena's emergency protocol. Without it, they couldn't send the evidence to her network of allies or alert law enforcement to Blake's assault on the hotel. Martin looked at the blueprint, calculating distances and timing, then made a decision that would have terrified him a week ago, but now felt like natural instinct. "Sophia, take over my position," he said, handing her the recording equipment. "I'm going to create a distraction." "Papa, that's too dangerous," Sophia protested, but Martin was already moving through the passages toward the hotel's main staircase. Elena's tactical notes had included detailed instructions for psychological warfare, ways to use the hotel's reputation and atmosphere to unnerve attackers who weren't familiar with the building's real history. Blake's men knew they were hunting for evidence, but they didn't know they were walking through a building where heroes had once saved children from people exactly like them. Martin began implementing Elena's distraction protocols, using the hotel's sound system to play recordings of children's voices. not threatening, just the echoes of laughter and conversation from the building's operational years. To men who were used to intimidating opponents through violence, the sounds of invisible children would be deeply unsettling. The psychological effect was immediate. Through the surveillance cameras, Martin watched Blake's men become nervous and jumpy, starting to see movement in shadows and hearing footsteps where none existed. The hotel itself was becoming their enemy, turning their violence back against them. "What is this place?" one of the searchers muttered into his radio, spinning. Around at sounds only he could hear. "It's a building," Blake's voice snapped back. "Stop letting it get to you and find that evidence." But Martin could hear the strain in Blake's voice too. The man who had spent 40 years believing he could control any situation through money and violence was discovering that some battles couldn't be won with brute force. Elena had prepared defenses that went beyond physical barriers. She had turned the hotel's history into a weapon against those who would destroy it. The distraction worked exactly as Elena had planned. While Blake's men searched for the source of the children's voices, Carlos was able to reach the communication equipment and activate the emergency broadcast that would send Elena's evidence to journalists and law enforcement across the country. "Message sent, Papa," Carlos reported through the earpiece. "Mama's friends are going to get everything." Martin felt a surge of fierce pride in his son's courage, followed immediately by the realization that they had just crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Blake's 40-year cover-up was about to be exposed to the world, and he would do anything to prevent that from happening. The final confrontation was about to begin. Elena's wedding ring gleamed in Blake's trembling, and as he stood in the hotel's lobby, the simple gold band catching the harsh light from his men's flashlights. Martin saw it from his hidden position at the top of the grand staircase and felt his world shift on its axis. Blake hadn't just been covering up his family's crimes, he had been directly involved in Elena's murder. "I know you're watching, Reyes," Blake called out, his voice echoing through the damaged lobby. "Your wife was wearing this when we pulled her body from that ravine in Guatemala. She thought she was so clever, faking her own death, but we were tracking her the whole time." Martin's hands clenched into fists as Blake continued his confession, apparently confident that none of them would survive to testify about what they'd heard. The man's desperation had stripped away his careful facade, revealing the monster underneath. "Elena, and thought she could protect you by disappearing," Blake said, turning the ring over in his palm. "But family is leverage, Mr. Reyes. It always has been. She came out of hiding when we threatened to hurt you and the children, and that's when we got her." The recording equipment Sophia was operating captured every word, but Martin barely noticed. Elena hadn't just faked her death, she had actually died, killed by Blake's people when they used her family as bait to draw her into the open. 15 years of hoping she might still be alive somewhere collapsed into fresh grief and white-hot rage. "Papa," Sophia's voice whispered through his earpiece, "I can see 3 more men coming up the back stairs. They're trying to surround us." Martin forced himself to focus on tactics rather than emotion. Elena's strategic notes had prepared for this exact scenario. Blake's forces attempting to corner them in the hotel's upper floors, while demolition equipment waited outside to destroy any evidence that survived the confrontation. But Elena had also prepared for psychological warfare. Blake's confession about Elena's death was being broadcast live to law enforcement agencies across multiple states, thanks to Carlos's successful activation of the emergency communication system. Even if Blake's men killed the entire family, his crimes would still be exposed. "Mr. Blake," Martin called down from the staircase, finally revealing his position, "you're confessing to murder on an open channel being monitored by the FBI. Even if you kill us, you're finished." Blake's face twisted with fury as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "Then I have nothing left to lose, do I?" The shooting started immediately, Blake's men opened fire on Martin's position while others began a systematic assault on every possible hiding place in the hotel. But Elena's defensive preparations extended beyond hidden passages. She had reinforced key structural points and created protected positions that could withstand sustained attack. Martin grabbed Sophia and pulled her into the armored safe room. Elena had constructed behind the hotel's main office, where they could monitor the building's surveillance cameras and coordinate with Carlos, who was still hidden in the tower room. "They're searching room by room," Sophia reported, watching the camera feeds with remarkable composure for a 12-year-old under fire. "But they don't know about the sub-basement entrance to the archive." Martin studied Elena's blueprint one more time, looking for options he'd missed. The hotel's design was more sophisticated than he'd realized. Elena hadn't just hidden evidence here, she had created a fortress capable of withstanding exactly this kind of assault. "Carlos, can you reach the main electrical panel?" Martin asked. Through the earpiece, Elena marked something called Emergency Protocol 7 on the blueprint. "I see it, Papa. There's a big red switch marked EP7. Should I flip it?" Martin checked Elena's tactical notes. Emergency Protocol 7 activated the hotel's hidden security systems, blast shutters over the windows, reinforced barriers in the corridors, and most importantly, a direct communication link to federal law enforcement that would bring help. Within minutes. "Do it, son." The hotel transformed around them as Elena's hidden systems came online. Steel shutters slammed down over the windows, turning the building into a fortress that Blake's men couldn't escape from any more than the Reyes family could. Hidden cameras with night vision capability gave Martin a complete view of his attackers' positions, while automated systems began broadcasting their locations to incoming law enforcement. "What the hell?" Blake's voice cut off as he realized his assault had become a trap. Elena had anticipated that eventually someone would try to destroy the hotel with violence, and she had prepared accordingly. But Blake wasn't finished. Through the surveillance cameras, Martin watched him pull out a device that looked like a military detonator. If he couldn't suppress Elena's evidence through violence, he would destroy the entire building with explosives, taking everyone inside with it. Explosive charges on the foundation, Martin realized, checking Elena's notes for any countermeasures she might have prepared. Blake came ready to level the entire place. Sophia's face went pale as she understood the implications. "Papa, even if the police come, they won't get here before he sets off the bombs." Martin found Elena's response to this scenario in her tactical notes. A final protocol that would preserve the archive's evidence, even if the hotel was destroyed. But activating it would require someone to manually transfer the data from the archive's servers to Elena's backup transmission system, a process that would take several minutes in the most dangerous part of the building. "I have to go to the archive," Martin said, gathering the portable drives and Elena's contact codes. "Sophia, stay here and guide me through the surveillance cameras. Carlos, keep monitoring the police frequency. We need to know when help arrives." The journey through the hotel's hidden passages to the archive felt like descending into a war zone. Blake's men were systematically destroying every room, looking for evidence they would never find, while Blake himself prepared to eliminate the entire building. But Elena's defensive systems were holding, giving Martin the time he needed to reach her hidden stronghold. The archive's servers were already transferring Elena's evidence to secure locations across the country, but the process wasn't fast enough. Blake's detonator would trigger the explosives before the transmission was complete, destroying 40 years of documentation about his family's crimes. Martin began the manual override Elena had built into her systems, his hands flying over keyboards and switches while explosions echoed through the building above him. Blake had started setting off smaller charges, testing his explosives, while his men continued their futile search for evidence that was already beyond their reach. "Papa, police are coming up the mountain road," Carlos reported through the earpiece. "But Blake sees them too. He's moving toward the main detonator." Martin finished the manual transfer just as the first federal agents reached the hotel's perimeter. Elena's evidence was now safely stored in multiple locations, but Blake still had the power to destroy the building and everyone inside it. Through the surveillance cameras, Martin watched Blake make his final desperate play. Standing in the lobby, where Martin's family had first slept 3 weeks ago, the man who had spent 40 years covering up his crimes raised the detonator with Elena's wedding ring still clutched in his other hand. "If I can't have the truth buried," Blake shouted, "then I'll bury it under rubble." But Elena had prepared for this moment too. As Blake pressed the detonator, her final defensive system activated, emergency protocols that redirected the explosive. Charges away from the archive and toward empty sections of the building, creating controlled collapses that would trap Blake's men but preserve the evidence and the family she had died to protect. The hotel shook as explosions rocked its foundations, but Elena's engineering held. The archive remained intact, the surveillance systems continued broadcasting, and the Reyes family survived to see justice finally served. When the dust settled and federal agents flooded into the building, they found Harrison Blake unconscious. In the rubble of his own making, Elena's wedding ring still clenched in his fist, the final piece of evidence that would connect him to 15 years of cover-ups and a murder that had haunted a family's dreams. Elena's sacrifice had finally been avenged. The restored hotel guest register gleamed under the warm lights of the Mountain View Inn's reopened lobby, its leather binding pristine and its pages filled with signatures from visitors who came not as tourists, but as pilgrims. 6 months after Harrison Blake's conviction and the exposure of his family's 40-year conspiracy, the hotel had been transformed from a crumbling ruin into a living memorial that honored both the children who had been saved and the heroes who had saved them. Martin ran his finger down the guest register's most recent entries, reading names and messages that told stories of healing and hope. Maria Santos, now 73 years old, had traveled from California to see the room where she had hidden as a 7-year-old refugee in 1967. James Chen had brought his grandchildren to show them where their great-aunt Eleanor had first found safety in America. Anna Kowalski had left a simple message. "Thank you for preserving our history." "Papa, the documentary crew is here," Sophia called from the hotel's front desk, where she was helping Mrs. Chen coordinate the day's visitors. At 13, Sophia had grown into her role as the hotel's youngest historian, able to tell the stories of Elena's investigation and the Sparrow's legacy with the same precision she once brought to decoding her mother's journals. The documentary about Elena's life and the exposure of Blake's trafficking network had aired the previous month, bringing international attention to the Mountain View Inn and the rescue operations it had housed. But more importantly, it had inspired a new generation of activists and investigators to continue the work Elena had died to advance. Martin walked through the hotel's restored rooms, each one now dedicated to telling part of the story that had been buried for so long. Room 312, where he had first found Elena's journal, had become a research center where journalists and law enforcement officials could access Elena's complete archive. The tower room, where children had once carved their names into the wooden beams, now served as a memorial where survivors could add their own stories to the historical record. The hotel's hidden passages remained intact, but were no longer secret. Guided tours showed visitors how the Sparrow's network had operated, how children had been moved safely through the building, and how Elena had used the same routes to coordinate modern rescue operations. The passages that had once hidden refugees now educated the public about the ongoing fight against human trafficking. "Mr. Reyes?" A young woman approached him in the lobby, holding a manila folder thick with documents. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Children's Defense Coalition. We received your application to expand the memorial program." Martin nodded, accepting the folder with hands that were no longer calloused from construction work, but steady with purpose. The insurance settlement from Blake's attack on the hotel, combined with federal grants for historical preservation, had provided enough funding to restore the building and establish the Memorial Foundation. But Martin's real dream was bigger: to turn the Mountain View Inn into an active rescue operation that could continue Elena's work. "The review board approved your proposal," Sarah said with a smile. "Congratulations. The Mountain View Center for Family Reunification will receive full federal funding to begin operations next month." Carlos, now 9, and somehow both more serious and more joyful than before their ordeal, looked up from the computer where he was cataloging new additions to Elena's archive. "Does that mean we get to help find missing kids, like Mama did?" "It means we get to help families stay together," Martin said, kneeling down to his son's level. "And when they can't stay together, we help them find each other again. The center would serve multiple functions: a resource for families searching for missing relatives, a safe house for children who needed temporary protection, and a training facility for law enforcement and social workers who dealt with trafficking cases. Elena's methods and contacts would finally be shared openly, turned from secrets into tools that could save lives on a much larger scale." Mrs. Chen emerged from the hotel's restored kitchen, carrying a tray of tea and the kind of cookies that had become legendary among the center's staff and visitors. At 85, she had found new purpose as the memorial's chief historian, working with Sophia to ensure that every rescued child's story was properly preserved and honored. The survivors. "Reunion is next week," Mrs. Chen said, settling into one of the lobby's comfortable chairs. "We have confirmations from 43 people who were helped by the Sparrow between 1943 and 1975. Some are bringing their children and grandchildren." Martin felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he thought about the reunion. Elena should have been there to see the faces of the adults who had once been the frightened children she saved. But in a way she would be present, in the stories that would be shared, in the building that had sheltered so many, and in the work that would continue because of her sacrifice. "Papa," Sophia said, approaching with a letter that had arrived. "In that morning's mail. This is addressed to the Sparrow. Should I add it to the memorial collection?" Martin took the letter, noting the childish handwriting and the return address from a refugee resettlement center in Texas. Inside was a drawing of a bird in flight and a simple message: "Thank you for saving my sister. She told me about the hotel where people help children. Someday I want to help children too." These letters arrived weekly now, sent by children who had heard about Elena's work and wanted to add their voices to the growing movement. The Sparrow's legacy was inspiring a new generation of protectors, people who understood that saving one child could change the entire world. As the afternoon sun streamed through the lobby's restored windows, Martin sat down at the guest register and wrote his own entry for the day. 6 months ago, he had been a desperate father facing eviction, buying a condemned hotel for 50 cents because he had nowhere else to turn. Today, he was the director of a memorial foundation and rescue center that honored his wife's memory while continuing her mission. "Martin Reyes, director," he wrote in the guest register. "Still learning from Elena, still fighting for families, still believing in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things." Sophia and Carlos joined him at the register, adding their own signatures below his. They had lost their mother twice, once to Blake's lies and once to the truth about her sacrifice, but they had found something even more precious in return. They had found their purpose, their community, and their place in a story that was much larger than their own grief. Outside the hotel, the Colorado mountains stretched toward the horizon where Eleanor had disappeared 15 years ago. But she wasn't lost anymore. She lived on in every child who found safety, in every family that was reunited, and in every person who chose to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The Mountain View Inn had finally become what Elena always envisioned, not just a memorial to past heroism, but a beacon of hope for future generations. The Sparrow's work would continue, carried forward by new hands, but guided by the same principles that had saved hundreds of lives across 4 decades. Martin closed the guest register and looked around the bustling lobby, where staff members prepared for the evening's orientation session for new volunteers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children who needed protection, and new families who needed hope. But tonight, for the first time since Elena's disappearance, Martin felt complete. He had found his way home to the place where their story had truly begun, and where it would continue for generations to come. The hotel had called them here for a reason, and that reason had finally become clear. They weren't just preserving Elena's legacy, they were living it.